What Trump just did is in the Bible. Iran and Venezuela. Two nations, two continents, two separate crises, and one president issuing warnings to both, in the same season, in the same tone, with the same unmistakable message. One is in the Middle East, the epicenter of biblical prophecy. The other is in South America, thousands of miles from Jerusalem, seemingly disconnected from anything prophetic. Why these two nations? Why now? Why at the same time? What if this isn't about politics at all? What if this is about positioning? Let's start with Iran. What Trump just did to Iran. Picture this moment. I need you to understand the context before we examine what Trump actually did. Because the context is what makes this action so significant prophetically. Iran is already under unprecedented pressure. Their economy isn't just struggling, it's in freefall. The Iranian rial has lost nearly 40% of its value. Inflation has made basic goods unaffordable for ordinary citizens. Shopkeepers in Tehran's Grand Bazaar, the merchants who have kept the Iranian economy moving for generations, closed their stalls and walked into the streets in protest. And it didn't stop there. Within days, protests erupted in 27 different cities across Iran. Students joined, truckers joined, bus drivers, factory workers. This wasn't one group with one grievance. This was a nation fracturing from the inside out. But here's what made the regime's situation even more desperate. And this connects directly to what Trump did. And it's going to become essential when we examine the birth pang pattern and see how all of this fits together. Iran had just emerged from a 12-day military confrontation with Israel. Iranian forces and proxies had been hit hard. The regime that projects strength throughout the Middle East was suddenly looking vulnerable, both externally on the battlefield and internally in the streets. The regime was cornered, pressured from outside, crumbling from within. And that's when President Trump issued a warning that sent shockwaves around the world. Just before 3 a.m. Eastern Time, while most of America was asleep, Trump posted a direct message to Iran's leadership. And the language was unlike anything we typically see in diplomatic communications. If Iran shoots and violently kills peaceful protesters, the United States of America will come to their rescue. We are locked and loaded and ready to go. Locked and loaded. I need you to understand what those words mean, because this is going to become absolutely crucial when we examine the prophetic significance of this moment. And it connects directly to what we'll see Trump do to Venezuela. This isn't diplomatic language. Diplomats don't say locked and loaded. State Department officials don't threaten military intervention over Twitter in the middle of the night. Carefully worded policy statements leave room for interpretation, for negotiation, for face-saving retreats. But locked and loaded leaves no room. It's military language. It means weapons are ready, forces are positioned, the trigger is prepared to be pulled. And Trump directed this language at the nation explicitly named in Ezekiel's end times prophecy. But here's what makes this even more significant. And this connects to what we just examined about Iran's biblical identity, and it's going to become even more important when we examine the birth pang patterns. This wasn't an isolated statement. This was part of a posture. Think about what the Trump administration has already done to Iran. They withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal. They reimposed crippling sanctions. Iran didn't back down. Iran's Secretary of the National Security Council fired back with a counter-threat that raised the temperature even higher. Trump should know that American interference in this internal issue is equivalent to chaos across the entire region and the destruction of American interests. Chaos across the entire region. Destruction of American interests. Think about what Iran is threatening. Not just retaliation against military targets, regional chaos, the destabilization of the entire Middle East, attacks on American interests wherever they can be found. This is escalation, not de-escalation. This is doubling down, not backing down. And here's what makes this exchange so prophetically significant. Because this connects to everything we've examined about Persia's role in Scripture, and it's going to become absolutely crucial when we see how Venezuela fits into this picture. This is pressure at a prophetic fault line. Think about the timing. The Middle East is already volatile. Israel has already engaged in direct conflict with Iranian forces. The Abraham Accords have realigned regional alliances. Saudi Arabia and Israel are closer than ever. The entire region is pressurizing. Nations are choosing sides. And in the middle of all of this, the most powerful nation on earth issues a direct military threat to the nation explicitly named in Ezekiel's end times prophecy. The nation that will be part of the coalition against Israel in the last days. The nation that is already aligned with Russia, another key player in Ezekiel 38, all positioned against the Jewish state. That nation is now being directly confronted by the world's dominant military power. But here's what I need you to see, and this is going to become absolutely essential when we examine why this moment feels different, and it connects to the snare Jesus warned about in Scene 9. This isn't invasion. Not yet. There are no American troops crossing into Iranian territory, no missiles flying between Washington and Tehran in full-scale war. But it's also not peace. It's something in between, something that builds pressure without releasing it, something that draws lines and dares the other side to cross them, something that ratchets tension higher and higher without triggering the explosion. Yet. And that in-between state, that's exactly what Jesus described. Wars and rumors of wars. We're in the rumor phase, the threat phase, the phase where everyone can feel that something is coming, but nothing has fully erupted yet. But here's what makes this particular rumor phase so significant. And this connects to what we'll examine about the birth pang pattern. And it becomes absolutely essential when we see the same pattern applied to Venezuela. The rumors are getting louder. The threats are getting more direct. The pressure is getting more intense. Locked and loaded isn't a whisper. It's a shout. And Iran's counter-threat of chaos across the entire region isn't a diplomatic hedge. It's a promise of escalation. The space between rumor and war is shrinking. But here's what most people miss about this moment, and this is going to become crucial when we examine the prophetic pattern the prophets saw. Trump isn't just confronting Iran in isolation. At the same time, he's pressuring Iran militarily. He's applying economic pressure to Iran's allies and partners, including Venezuela, which means the squeeze isn't happening on one front. It's happening on multiple fronts simultaneously. But before we can understand Venezuela's role, we need to establish the biblical framework that makes sense of all of this. Because what we're seeing isn't random confrontation. It fits a pattern Jesus described 2,000 years ago. And that pattern is going to become absolutely essential for understanding everything that follows. Here's something most people don't realize. Iran isn't just a modern nation with modern conflicts. Iran has a biblical identity that stretches back thousands of years. And that identity has never left Scripture. The nation we call Iran today was known in the ancient world as Persia. And Persia appears throughout the Bible, not as a minor footnote, but as a major player in God's prophetic narrative. In the book of Daniel, Persia is the empire that conquers Babylon. The handwriting on the wall that Daniel interprets? It announces the transfer of power to the Medes and Persians. Daniel himself serves in the Persian government under Cyrus and Darius. But here's what makes Persia's biblical role so significant. And this connects directly to what we'll examine about Iran's position in end times prophecy. Persia is explicitly named in Ezekiel 38. Ezekiel 38:5 lists the nations that will come against Israel in the last days as part of a massive coalition led by Gog from the land of Magog, and right there, in black and white, is Persia. This isn't speculation. This isn't symbolic interpretation. Persia is named, by name, as part of the end times coalition that moves against Israel. But here's what I need you to understand, and this is going to become essential when we examine the birth pang framework in Scene 3, and it explains why the timing of current events matters so much. Ezekiel 38 hasn't been fulfilled yet. The invasion Ezekiel describes, the coalition of nations moving against Israel from the north, hasn't happened. The conditions aren't fully in place. We're not there yet. But here's what's sobering about Iran's current trajectory. And this connects to what Trump just did. Prophecy doesn't start with invasion. Prophecy starts with positioning. Think about what has to happen before Ezekiel 38 can be fulfilled. Nations have to align. Alliances have to form. Iran has to be in a position, militarily, politically, ideologically, where joining a coalition against Israel makes sense. And look at where Iran is right now. They're aligned with Russia. They're hostile to Israel. They've funded proxies throughout the Middle East. Hezbollah, Hamas, militias in Iraq and Syria, all positioned against the Jewish state. Their leadership regularly calls for Israel's destruction. Iran is moving along the trajectory that leads to Ezekiel 38, not fulfilling it today, but positioning for it, aligning toward it, moving in the direction the prophet described. And here's what makes this so important, because this connects directly to the pressure Trump just applied. What's happening with Iran and Venezuela is not the fulfillment of specific prophecy. Let me be very clear about that. Ezekiel 38 hasn't happened. The tribulation hasn't started. We're not in the final 7 years. I'm not claiming that Trump's actions fulfill any specific prophetic text. But here's what I am saying, and this is anchored directly in Scripture. Matthew 24:6-8. And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And there shall be famines, and pestilences, and earthquakes, in divers places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. The beginning of sorrows. In the original Greek, that phrase is Odin, birth pangs, labor pains. Jesus is describing a pattern, not a single event, but a process. Contractions that start slow and spaced out, but gradually increase in frequency and intensity until they become unavoidable. And here's what makes the birth pang framework so important for understanding what's happening right now. And this connects directly to what we'll examine about Venezuela in Scenes 5 and 6. And it becomes absolutely crucial when we see why everything is converging in Scene 8. Birth pangs don't announce the exact moment of delivery. They announce that the process has started. A woman in labor doesn't know precisely when the baby will arrive after the first contraction, but she knows something has begun that will only intensify until delivery comes. That's what Jesus is describing about the end times. Wars, rumors of wars, nations rising against nations, famines, earthquakes, pestilences, all of it increasing in frequency and intensity, all of it building toward something. And here's the key insight, because this is going to become crucial when we see Iran and Venezuela together, and it explains why the simultaneous timing matters so much. The contractions aren't new, the spacing is what's changed. We've seen Middle East tensions before. We've seen economic pressure on hostile nations before. We've seen American presidents issue warnings before. But we haven't seen everything stacking simultaneously like this. Iran pressured, Venezuela pressured, both in the same season, both with the same tone, both while the Middle East sits on the edge of wider conflict. The contractions are coming closer together. But Iran is only half the picture. And here's where things get really interesting. Because the Bible doesn't just focus on the Middle East, and what we're about to examine about Venezuela will reveal a dimension of prophecy most people overlook. Here's something that often gets overlooked in prophetic discussions, and this is going to become essential when we examine what Trump just did to Venezuela, and absolutely critical when we see how it connects to the larger pattern in Scene 7. The Bible's prophetic focus is on Israel and the Middle East. That's undeniable. Jerusalem is the center of God's prophetic calendar. The nations immediately surrounding Israel, including Persia, are explicitly named in end times passages. But here's what most people miss. The Bible also shows that nations far from Israel still affect her fate. Think about the economic connections, trade routes, oil, resources, alliances. Nations that have never set foot in the Middle East can still strengthen or weaken Israel's enemies through economic relationships. Revelation 18 describes the fall of Babylon, a system of global commerce that has enriched the merchants of the earth. Kings and traders weep when this system collapses because their wealth was tied to it. But here's what makes this significant for understanding Venezuela. And this connects directly to the pattern we're about to examine. Before nations collapse, their wealth is often stripped. Before military defeat comes economic pressure. And that pattern, economic pressure preceding larger judgment, is exactly what we're seeing applied right now to Iran and to Venezuela. But wait, Venezuela? What does a South American nation have to do with biblical prophecy? Why should we care about a country nowhere near Israel? That's what we need to examine next. Because Venezuela's role is more significant than most people realize, and it's going to connect directly to everything we've discussed about Iran. Scene 5. Venezuela, the oil gatekeeper in the Western Hemisphere. Here's why Venezuela matters, and this is going to become absolutely crucial when we see what Trump just did in Scene 6, and essential for understanding the pattern the prophets saw in Scene 7. Venezuela sits on one of the largest proven oil reserves in the entire world. Some estimates put it as the largest. More oil than Saudi Arabia, more than Iran, more than Russia. In a world that still runs on oil, that makes Venezuela enormously strategic. But here's what makes Venezuela's position so significant prophetically. And this connects to the economic warfare pattern we just examined. And it's going to become even more important when we see why this is happening now. The Venezuelan regime has cultivated relationships with Iran. Yes, the same Iran we just discussed. The same Persia named in Ezekiel 38. But here's what's truly significant. And this is going to become essential when we see what Trump just did. And it connects directly to the Revelation 18 themes we examined earlier. Venezuela represents economic leverage in the Western Hemisphere for nations hostile to Israel and her allies. Think about what that means. A nation thousands of miles from Jerusalem with no direct military threat to Israel, can still strengthen the economic position of Israel's enemies. Oil money flowing to Iran, sanctions relief through back channels, economic partnerships that undermine Western pressure. The biblical principle holds: nations far from Israel still affect her fate. Just as Trump issued warnings to Iran, he's applied pressure to Venezuela. Sanctions, economic restrictions, direct warnings to the regime, pressure that targets the oil wealth Venezuela has used to sustain its government and support its allies. But here's what makes this significant. Is there a biblical pattern for this kind of dual pressure? Does the Bible show us anything about how God confronts nations before larger events unfold? That's what we need to examine next, because the prophets saw something that looks remarkably familiar. Here's what the prophets consistently recorded, and this is going to tie everything we've examined together, and it connects directly to why this is happening. Here's what makes the current moment unlike anything we've seen in recent history. And this connects everything we've examined about Iran and Venezuela to the larger prophetic picture. And it's going to become essential when we examine Jesus' warning about the snare in the next scene. The convergence is unprecedented. Think about what's happening simultaneously. Israel is at the center of global attention. Events are compressing. Decisions are stacking. The space between contractions is shrinking. In the past, these crises might have happened sequentially, one resolved before the next emerged. But now, they're happening simultaneously. Here's something that most people have completely missed about what's happening in the Middle East. And this is going to connect directly to the pressure on Iran and Venezuela. And it becomes absolutely essential for understanding why this moment feels different from anything in modern history. While Trump pressures Iran with military threats and Venezuela with economic sanctions, something else is happening in the Middle East that's reshaping the entire region: the Abraham Accords. And what's really happening with these peace agreements is far more significant than the headlines suggest. Let me show you what I mean, because once you see the pattern, you'll understand why the pressure on Iran isn't happening in isolation. It's happening as part of a larger realignment that the prophets described thousands of years ago. The Abraham Accords began in 2020, when Israel signed normalization agreements with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. Then came Sudan, then Morocco. 4 Arab nations that had technically been in a state of war with Israel for decades, suddenly establishing diplomatic relations, trade agreements, and security cooperation. These aren't just diplomatic agreements. They're a fundamental realignment of the Middle East. For 70 years, the Arab world was officially united against Israel. Every Arab nation maintained the same position: no recognition, no negotiation, no peace until the Palestinian issue was resolved. That consensus is shattering. And here's what's driving the change. The Sunni Arab nations, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, and others, aren't making peace with Israel because they suddenly love the Jewish state. They're making peace because they fear the Persian state even more. Think about what that means geopolitically. Iran has been building influence across the Middle East for decades, and the Sunni Arab nations watched this expansion with growing alarm. And suddenly, Israel, the nation the Arab world had officially opposed for 7 decades, looked less like an enemy and more like an ally against a common threat. But here's where this becomes prophetically significant. And this is going to become essential when we examine the snare Jesus warned about. Daniel 9:27. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate. He shall confirm the covenant with many. Now, let me be very clear about something before we go any further. I am not saying the Abraham Accords are the fulfillment of Daniel 9:27. The Antichrist hasn't been revealed. The tribulation hasn't started. We're not in the final 7 years. But here's what I am saying. The infrastructure for such a covenant is being built right now. Think about what's happening. Peace agreements between Israel and Arab nations, security cooperation against a common enemy, economic integration, diplomatic normalization, a framework of regional cooperation that didn't exist a decade ago. The Abraham Accords aren't the covenant Daniel described, but they're creating the conditions where such a covenant becomes possible. And here's what makes the current moment so significant. Saudi Arabia is the prize. The Abraham Accords included the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco. But not Saudi Arabia. Not yet. And Saudi Arabia is the key to everything. Saudi Arabia is the guardian of Islam's two holiest sites, Mecca and Medina. Saudi Arabia is the leader of the Sunni Arab world. Saudi Arabia is the nation whose recognition would transform Israel's position in the region more than any other. And Saudi Arabia is closer to normalization with Israel than at any point in history. Think about what's been happening. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman meeting with Israeli officials. Saudi Arabia opening its airspace to Israeli flights. Back-channel negotiations that have become increasingly public. The framework of a deal being constructed. Sound familiar? Daniel's covenant with many isn't described as a peace treaty with Israel alone. It's a covenant with many, a multilateral agreement, a regional framework, a structure that binds multiple nations together. And that's exactly what's being negotiated right now. But here's what most people don't see, and this connects to everything we've examined about Iran and Venezuela, and it's absolutely essential for understanding what's really happening. The pressure on Iran isn't separate from the Abraham Accords. It's connected. Every sanction on Iran makes the Arab nations feel more secure about aligning with Israel. Every military threat to Tehran makes normalization less risky for Riyadh. Every squeeze on the Persian regime creates space for the regional realignment to accelerate. Trump's locked and loaded warning to Iran isn't just about Iran. It's about reshaping the entire Middle East. And the Venezuela sanctions? They target an Iranian ally, weakening the economic network that supports the regime. Every front matters. Every pressure point contributes to the larger picture. But here's what should make every believer pay attention. The pieces are moving into place. Iran isolated and pressured. Arab nations aligning with Israel. The framework for a regional covenant being constructed. The infrastructure for Daniel's prophecy being built in real time. We're watching the table being set. The final meal hasn't been served yet, but the preparation is unmistakable. And that preparation leads us to something Jesus specifically warned about. Something that most people completely overlook. Something that explains why so many will be caught off guard when everything accelerates. Now we come to a warning that Jesus gave specifically about the end times. And this is going to connect everything we've examined about Iran, Venezuela, and the Abraham Accords. And it explains why what's happening right now is so dangerous for those who aren't paying attention. Jesus used a word that should stop every believer in their tracks. A snare. Luke 21:34-35. And take heed to yourselves, lest at any time your hearts be overcharged with surfeiting, and drunkenness, and cares of this life, and so that day come upon you unawares. For as a snare shall it come on all them that dwell on the face of the whole earth. A snare doesn't announce itself. Think about what a snare is. It's a trap designed to catch prey by surprise. The animal walking through the forest doesn't see it coming. One moment, freedom. The next moment, caught. The snare works precisely because it's hidden until it springs. And Jesus says that day, the day of his return, the culmination of everything the prophets described, will come as a snare on all them that dwell on the face of the whole earth. Not some of them, all of them. But here's what Jesus specifically warned about, and this is where his words become intensely practical. He said, "Take heed to yourselves." Not take heed to the headlines, not take heed to the prophecy charts, not take heed to the political developments. Take heed to yourselves. The danger isn't that you won't know what's happening in the world. The danger is what's happening in your own. Trump sparks end times panic after leaving the world shocked with this statement. Something satisfactorily shifted this week, and if you weren't paying attention, you might have missed it. It's what Donald Trump said. "I have to say this about Greenland. We need Greenland from a national security situation. It's so strategic right now. Greenland is covered with Russian and Chinese ships all over the place. We need Greenland from the standpoint of national security, and Denmark is not going to be able to do it. I can tell you." Now, if that were all he said, this might have been a one-day headline. Provocative? Sure. Controversial? Absolutely. But politicians make bold statements all the time. What made this different? What made the entire world stop and take notice? Was what came next. Trump didn't back down. He doubled down. And then he escalated in ways that no one expected. He said, "If we don't go in, Russia will go in, and China will go in. And there's not a thing that Denmark can do about it, but we can do everything about it." He said, "We are going to do something on Greenland whether they like it or not. Because if we don't do it, Russia or China will take over Greenland. And we're not going to have Russia or China as a neighbor." He said, "One way or the other, we're going to have Greenland." And when reporters pressed him on how far he was willing to go, what methods he would use, his answers sent chills through diplomatic channels around the world. He simply said, "You'll find out." You'll find out. 3 words that left everything on the table. Military action, economic coercion, diplomatic pressure. No option explicitly ruled out. No line clearly drawn. Just ambiguity. The kind of ambiguity that makes allies nervous and enemies calculating. But here's what truly shocked the world. And this is where this story transforms from political drama into something that should capture the attention of every believer watching. Trump didn't stop at words. He didn't stop at threats. He took action. And the action he took wasn't aimed at America's enemies. It was aimed at America's closest friends. Within days of these statements, Trump announced tariffs, not on Russia, not on China, not on Iran or North Korea, but on 8 European nations: Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, Finland, all NATO allies, all nations that have stood shoulder to shoulder with the United States for over 70 years. All of them suddenly targeted with economic weapons that, until this moment, were reserved for adversaries. The reaction was immediate, and it was unlike anything we've seen in modern diplomatic history. Emergency meetings were convened across Europe, some within hours of the announcement. The European Union issued statements of condemnation. NATO officials scrambled to assess whether the alliance itself could survive this kind of internal fracture. Stock markets dropped as investors processed the implications of a potential transatlantic trade war. The Swedish government publicly refused to be blackmailed. France rejected what it called economic intimidation from an ally. And within days, several European nations began deploying military personnel to Greenland. Small contingents, largely symbolic, but the message was clear. We stand with Denmark. We will not be bullied. Think about that for a moment. Allied nations deploying troops, not to confront a shared enemy, but to signal resistance against the United States. This isn't the Cold War. This isn't a standoff with a hostile power. This is the Western Alliance, the foundation of global stability for 3/4 of a century, showing cracks that many believed were impossible. But here's the question that no one seems to be asking loudly enough. And it's the question that will frame everything I'm about to show you in this video. Why? What is it about this moment, this specific moment in history, that made the world react so violently to words that, in another era, might have been dismissed as political bluster? The answer isn't really about Greenland. It's not even really about Trump. Greenland is just the surface. Trump is just the catalyst. And if you're paying attention, if you're someone who reads Scripture and watches the world with discerning eyes, that revelation should hit differently than it does for everyone else. Because here's what most people don't realize, and this is where this story takes a turn that I need you to follow very carefully. What we're witnessing isn't just politics, it's a pattern that Jesus Christ himself described nearly 2,000 years ago. A pattern that the apostles warned the early church to watch for. A pattern that has appeared in Scripture for millennia, waiting for the generation that would see it unfold in real time. And if you understand what Jesus said, what's happening right now takes on an entirely different meaning. The birth pains are intensifying. The signs Jesus described are becoming harder and harder to dismiss. And the speed at which things are now moving should cause every believer to sit up. But here's what makes this even more unsettling. The statement about Greenland was shocking. The tariffs on allies were unprecedented. Now we need to go directly to Scripture. Because what I've shown you so far, the statement, the tariffs, the fracturing alliances, the economic warfare. In Matthew 24, the disciples came to Jesus privately and asked him a question that has echoed through every generation since. Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And Jesus answered them. He gave them a list of signs, not to frighten them, but to prepare them. And the very first thing he mentioned was this. Matthew 24:6-8 says, And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And there shall be famines, and pestilences, and earthquakes in divers places. All these are the beginning of sorrows. Did you catch that phrase at the end? The beginning of sorrows. In the original Greek, the word used is odin, which means birth pains, labor contractions, the kind of pain that comes before something new is born. But here's what's critical to understand, and this is where many people misread this passage. Birth pains are not the birth itself. They're the warning that the birth is approaching. They increase in frequency, they increase in intensity, but they come before the main event, not during it. Jesus is telling his disciples and us that when we see these patterns emerging, we shouldn't be surprised. We shouldn't panic. We should recognize them for what they are, signs that history is moving toward its conclusion. But here's what makes this passage even more relevant to what we're seeing today. And this connects directly to the Greenland situation and everything that followed. Notice what Jesus says about nations. Nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. For most of history, people have interpreted that as military conflict, armies clashing, wars fought with swords and spears, and eventually guns and bombs. And that interpretation isn't wrong. Military war is certainly part of what Jesus described. But the Greek word for nation here is ethnos, which can mean a nation-state, but also refers to people groups, ethnicities, and cultural identities. And the word for rise against doesn't necessarily mean armed combat. It means to stand against, to oppose, to be in conflict with. What we're witnessing right now, allies turning against allies, economic weapons deployed against friends, alliances fracturing over territory and resources, fits this description perfectly. Nation is rising against nation, not with tanks and missiles, but with tariffs and sanctions and political pressure. And Jesus said this would be just the beginning. But here's what most people miss, because understanding this is the key to understanding why this moment felt so different from normal politics. Jesus didn't just warn about what would happen. He warned about how people would respond. And that response, the fear, the panic, the desperation for security, is actually the greater danger. It's the setup for something Jesus warned about before he even mentioned wars and rumors of wars. Here's something that most people overlook when they study Jesus' teachings about the end times, and this might be the most important thing I show you in this entire video. When the disciples asked him what signs to watch for, the very first thing he said, before wars, before earthquakes, before famines, was this. Matthew 24, 4-5. Take heed that no man deceive you. For many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. Deception. That's the first warning. Not war, not disaster, deception. Now think back to everything I've shown you. When people are afraid, truly afraid, the kind of fear that grips your chest and keeps you awake at night, they become desperate. They look for solutions. They look for saviors. They look for anyone who promises to make the fear go away. And that desperation creates an opening for deception. Think about what happens during economic instability. Remember what I showed you: markets crash, jobs disappear, prices rise, retirement accounts shrink. And suddenly, people who felt secure feel vulnerable. They feel exposed, and they become willing to accept solutions they would have rejected when times were good. This is how strong men rise. This is how freedoms are traded for security. This is how populations embrace leaders and systems that promise stability, even if those leaders and systems come with strings attached that would have been unthinkable in calmer times. Fear doesn't just destabilize markets. Fear destabilizes discernment. When you're afraid, you don't think clearly. You react. You grasp at whatever seems to offer relief. And if someone comes along with confident answers, with promises of security, with assurances that they alone can fix the chaos, fear makes you more likely to believe them. This is why Jesus warned about deception first, because deception doesn't work on people who are calm, confident, and grounded. It works on people who are shaken, desperate, and afraid. And if you look at the world right now, the economic uncertainty, the fracturing alliances, the constant barrage of crises and conflicts, you're looking at conditions that are perfectly designed to make deception effective. Remember what I said about the speed of escalation. That speed doesn't just create fear. It prevents clear thinking. It's the perfect environment for deception to take root. But here's the good news. And this is why understanding this pattern matters so much, and why the next section is essential for maintaining proper perspective. If you recognize the trap, you don't have to fall into it. If you understand that fear is the setup for deception, you can guard your heart against both. Jesus didn't warn us about these things so we would panic. He warned us so we would be prepared, so we would recognize the patterns, so we would not be deceived when everyone around us is grasping at false solutions. Now I need to pause and say something very directly, because I know how easy it is to watch events like this unfold and jump to conclusions. And I know that some people watching this video are already wondering, is this it? Is this the end? Let me be clear. What I'm showing you is not the end. This is not the tribulation. This is not the rapture. This is not the final fulfillment of Matthew 24. And here's why getting this right matters so much. Because the difference between pattern recognition and date setting is the difference between the wisdom Jesus called us to and the foolishness he warned us against. What this is, and I want you to hear this carefully, is pattern recognition. Every generation has looked at the events of their time and seen signs of the end. Every generation has pointed to wars, famines, earthquakes, and political upheaval, and wondered if they were living in the final days. And they weren't wrong to wonder. Jesus told us to watch. He told us to be ready. He told us that these signs would come. But he also told us something else. He said, "The end is not yet." He said, "These things are the beginning of sorrows, birth pains, contractions that signal something is coming, but not the birth itself." So what makes this moment significant? Not that it's the end, but that the patterns are converging. And here's why that matters. And this connects to what I'll show you about false security in Scene 10. The convergence itself is revealing. It's exposing where our trust actually rests. Here's what I mean. In past generations, you might have seen economic instability in one region while other regions remained stable. You might have seen political conflict between certain nations while alliances elsewhere held firm. You might have seen natural disasters or cultural upheaval in isolated pockets, while the broader global system remained intact. What's different now is the convergence. Economic instability isn't isolated, it's global. Political fragmentation isn't regional, it's happening across continents. Alliances aren't just stressed, they're fracturing in ways that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. And the speed. Everything is accelerating. Remember what I showed you the pace of escalation isn't slowing down. It's increasing. Information moves instantly. Markets react in seconds. Crises that would have taken months to develop now unfold in days. This doesn't mean we're in the final chapter, but it does mean the birth pains are intensifying. The frequency is increasing. The patterns Jesus described are becoming harder to ignore. But here's what's equally important, and this is something many prophecy teachers forget to emphasize, and it's relevant for believers and skeptics alike. Whether you're a believer or a skeptic, the pattern is the same. And what we're watching right now looks a lot like the early stages of that pattern. So what does this mean for those who follow Christ? That's exactly what we need to talk about next. Because the response to all of this matters even more than the events themselves. If you're a believer watching this video, I need to speak directly to you right now. Because everything I've shown you, the geopolitical tension, the economic warfare, the fracturing alliances, the patterns that echo biblical prophecy, all of it can produce one of two responses: fear or faith. And only one of those responses honors God. And here's what's crucial. This is where the rubber meets the road. This is where everything I've shown you becomes personal. Let me say this as clearly as I can. You were not given a spirit of fear. 2 Timothy 1:7 says, "For God hath not given us the spirit of fear, but of power, and of love, and of a sound mind." A sound mind. That's what God has given you. Not panic, not anxiety, not the kind of fear that makes your heart fail as you watch the headlines. He's given you the ability to see clearly, think clearly, and stand firmly, even when everything around you is shaking. Remember what I told you in Scene 7 about fear and deception. A sound mind is your protection against both. And this is where believers must be different from the world. The world panics when markets drop. The world panics when alliances fracture. The world panics when the systems they've trusted begin to show cracks. Because for the world, those systems are everything. Their security is built on economies, governments, and human institutions. But for believers, our security is built on something, on someone that cannot be shaken. Now, our question of the day. What's the one pattern from this video that hit you the hardest?